Are you ready? It's coast to coast, we're here and we representing. Tom join her foundation. We about to jump right in it. The body is woke. HBCUs, let's go. Tradition, trendsetting. Let's do it for the culture. HBCUbiquity.
Welcome to the Tom Joyner Foundation presents HBCUbiquity. I'm your host, Thomas Joyner Jr., and on behalf of the Tom Joyner Foundation, thank you for joining us on today. Question: what is the true value of a college education? Well, many would agree that the value of a college degree is measured by the job or the career that you're able to obtain and how much it pays. And honestly, a subset of that answer may very well be how long it takes to pay off student loans with the job or the career that one's able to get with their college degree. But how does this relate to HBCUs, or historically black colleges and universities? After all, is it easier or is it harder to get a job, or better yet, a good paying and personally fulfilling job with a degree from an HBCU? What does the class of 2019 need to know about today's job market? I mean, with most, if not all, HBCUs having completed their commencement exercises by now, summer is here, and many graduates are in the process of putting their degrees to work. But is it harder for HBCU graduates to find meaningful employment in today's job market? Or should graduates from HBCUs pursue an additional degree to make themselves, quote-unquote, more marketable to potential employers? In this week's episode, we'll talk with Mr. John Ridgeway, a retired corporate executive and current vice chairman of the Delaware State University Board of Trustees. Oh, and by the way, Delaware State will be the Tom Joyner Foundation School of the Month for August 2019. We'll talk with Mr. Ridgeway about both the myths and realities about corporate America as it relates to HBCU graduates, along with some candor and knowledge that's helpful to these graduates as they embark on the first, or in some cases, second phases of their careers. We'll also talk with Ms. Dorothy Bland, who is currently a professor of journalism at the University of North Texas and is the former journalism director at Florida A&M University. We'll talk with her about both career and life advice for our HBCU grads, as well as current students that are inching closer to graduation. Yeah, this is a conversation that's probably bigger than one podcast. By all means, please chime in with your thoughts, suggestions, and experiences as they relate to this topic on our social media. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at HBCUbiquity, and that's HBCUbiquity. Thanks for being a part of this week's conversation, and let's get started. Welcome to another episode of HBCUbiquity.
Before we get back to the HBCUbiquity podcast, let's take a look at some Tom Joyner Foundation fundraising highlights. Here's an example of TJF's success.
Hi, my name is Andrew Davis. I am a junior music education major with a concentration in piano performance from Durham, North Carolina. Upon completing my degree, I would like to get a master's in conducting, and I would like to further my education by getting a PhD in either ethnomusicology or musicology, and using that degree to teach at a college or university. Thank you.
To donate to the Tom Joyner Foundation, just log on to www.tomjoynerfoundation.org, and you can help a student continue their education at a HBCU.
Welcome back to HBCUbiquity. This is Thomas Joyner Jr., and I'm joined today by Mr. John Ridgeway, friend of the Tom Joyner Foundation, retired corporate executive, and current vice chairman of the Board of Trustees for Delaware State University. How are you, John?
I'm doing fine, Thomas. How's things going for you?
Everything's going well today. Thanks for asking. You know, what's the biggest misconception that corporate America has about HBCUs and their graduates?
So one of the misconceptions that corporate America could possibly have is that HBCUs do not provide the pool of talent that compete with other institutions. And sometimes that misconception is fed by a lack of understanding and really get a good feel for what the HBCUs have to offer. Some of the stuff that you read about the financial situations of HBCUs can lead to that misconception. They're really not understanding some of the talent and some of the pool that we have, like aviation management, some of the engineering, some of the research we do on cancer research that you have at some of the finest HBCU institutions that we have, like Hampton, for example.
In other words, bad news about finances that does not necessarily equate to a bad education.
No, it doesn't.
Right.
No, it does not. I mean, we have some of the finest institutions out there that equip our students today that can make a fantastic contribution to any corporation.
And so your estimation, which majors would you say are in demand in today's job market that students, especially HBCU students, should consider taking up?
Well, I would say engineering, computer science, finance. However, our society is rapidly changing, and we're becoming more focused on mental health and wellness. We're starting to see a lot more concentration in the areas of medical research. As you see, more and more students and companies are finding solutions. Nursing is a hot area right now that individuals are focused on as well.
So STEM is still very much in demand.
Yes, it is, most definitely.
Well, regarding social media and the internet, what do today's undergraduates need to know or be mindful of if they, plan or pursuing a job or career after graduation?
Well, I would just say leverage the internet and social media to your advantage. It can be an effective tool if it's used correctly. It could also hurt you if it's not used with the right degree of responsibility. Social media never goes old. And some of the things that you may do by showing a lack of responsibility to come back and it can hurt you, or it could help you if you use appropriate degree of responsibility later on in your career.
All right. So kind of like, take control of your brand, so to speak.
There you go.
And manage it responsibly.
You're right.
So in terms of skills and traits, what are corporations looking for when hiring college graduates today?
Well, I could think of several skills and traits that you may need. Good communication skills, team building skills. You need good attitude, willing to learn. Don't be afraid to work. You definitely have to be coachable. You want someone to get right in there and be willing to make a contribution. Companies want to hire students that would help them be successful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so it's kind of like about, me telling my children about, spending less time on social media so that they don't, erode their communication skills, their people skills.
There you go. I mean, and when you really think of we're getting more from that, more of a collaborative environment, from that autocratic leadership style.
Yeah.
So you have to be able to deal with people. You have to be able to read and understand the needs and services that our customers need. You have to be able to lead people in some areas. You have to be able to solve problems. Those skills are needed today, and companies need the talent that's out there. And HBCUs have that talent.
Yeah, we have a strong history producing literally servant leaders.
We do. There's several examples out there where individuals that had graduated from HBCU have made a fantastic contribution, that are leading large companies and in leading teams at all different areas, different levels. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. And John, besides, pay and salary, what are some of the, and I'm asking this question on the flip side of what we're talking about now, but what are some of the factors that a college graduate should consider in a company before interviewing for a job?
Well, I think first you should do your history on the company. And then you should also, you want to make sure there's a fit. And you want to make sure there's a fit that a company is going to offer you the right benefits. They're going to help you to build a successful career. In some cases, it could be graduate studies. And you may have an interest that puts you involved with more of a philanthropic approach to things. You may want to have an area that's going to teach you different of the TQMs that's out there. If you're in engineering, if you're in manufacturing, things that's going to give you a real applicable experience that's really long-term, that's going to make you have a successful career.
And so with that said, John, especially for business school graduates this year, what would you recommend? Going to the workforce or considering graduate school first?
I would always recommend, it's just my personal recommendation, is that it really starts, Thomas, as to what you want your field to be in. If you want to be in operations, if you want to manage, then I would just suggest that you really get some hands-on experience. And then some companies will pay for your graduate studies. Mm-hmm. So it depends on, your learning style, your development style, what type of company you like to grow in. If you want to be in a large company, sometimes large companies will give you the experience and exposure that once you get that type of operational experience and you go back and get your master's degree, long-term is going to help you. Mm-hmm. Some of the smaller independent companies, you may want to continue to proceed with your graduate degree. Continue through grad school.
Yeah.
There's the opportunity for you to learn finances, which is, needed in today's world. Managing people, communications, problem solving skills, all those are critical. So it's really going to decide what type of career trajectory you want to pursue.
And while you're at it, John, do you have any career advice for the class of 2019?
Well, first, I'd like to wish them all the luck in the world in launching their career. I hope they're fortunate to have a successful one as I had. Secondly, I would just say learn as much about the company as you can and start preparing for your career today. Make sure your resume is error-free. Come to interviews on time. Learn as much about the company as you can. Study the company. Be able to ask the appropriate questions. You really want to get a feel for when you interview that the resume is accurate. I'm speaking to the person that's on paper. That's really critical. I know for me, I always spent a lot of time trying to figure out, I call it resume integrity. A lot of the resumes are doctored up, and then by the time you hire the individual and you put them into a real work environment, that the skills that they state in their resume just don't exist.
Yeah. And while we're still talking about HBCUs, John, do you have any updates on how's everything going at Delaware State these days?
I think Delaware State's doing very well. We have a lot to offer. Our student enrollment's going to reach an all-time high. We're going to exceed 5,000 students. We have an aviation program that's world-class. We're just getting ready to launch a new dormitory. Our president, Dr. Wilman Michoud, and our board chair, Dr. Devonna Williams. We have a very good strategic plan, and you're going to see some great things come out of school. Come visit us.
If I'm not mistaken, for listeners to this podcast that are living in the state of Delaware, they have an opportunity to go to Delaware State for free as well, don't they?
Yes, they do. We have the Inspire program that anyone that graduates with 2.75, and thank you for bringing that up, can attend Delaware State. Their tuition is paid free.
That's great to hear. Well, John, on behalf of the Tom Jordan Foundation and HBCUbiquity, thanks for your time today. I really appreciate this.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.
And we'll be back with more HBCUbiquity.
Before we get back to the HBCUbiquity podcast, let's take a look at some Tom Jordan Foundation fundraising highlights. Here's an example of TJF's success.
Hi, my name is Brenna Daniels. I'm a sophomore and aviation science major from Morganton, North Carolina. After completing my degree, I hope to fly for Samaritan's Purse, an international disaster relief ministry. I'd like to thank First Citizens Bank and the Tom Jordan Foundation for the scholarship and helping me to achieve my dream.
To donate to the Tom Jordan Foundation, just log on to www.tomjordanfoundation.org and you can help a student continue their education at a HBCU.
Welcome back to HBCUbiquity. This is Thomas Joyner Jr., and I'm joined today by Miss Dorothy Bland, Professor of Journalism at the Frank and Sue Mayborn School of Journalism at the University of North Texas, and former Professor and Journalism Director at Florida A&M University. Hello, Miss Bland. How are you today?
Hi. How are you doing today, Mr. Joyner?
I'm doing really well. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. It's a great day in Texas.
Journalism is a popular area of study for HBCU students. With that said, what is your sense of the job market today for aspiring journalists, print or non-print, with degrees from HBCUs?
I think there are tremendous opportunities. Communications remains an extremely competitive field, and there will be an increasing need for more diverse talent given the nation's growing diversity. When I think about what's actually happening in the world today, demographers predict that whites will no longer be the majority by 2045. We already are seeing significant shifts in the browning of America. Take Texas as an example. It's one of 5 majority-minority states in the nation. In case you're wondering what the other ones are, California, Nevada, Hawaii, and New Mexico. I also encourage you to keep an eye out on the census and encourage folks to participate as well as vote in the upcoming elections. I also think that it's important to note that when you look at birth rates, the ethnic minority children are now the majority in the United States. Of course, I think great journalism and storytelling will always matter. What's different, though, is that you need to have multiple skill sets. You need to be mobile, you need to be agile, and a multimedia journalist. And I'm thinking about Oprah Winfrey because I've had so many students come in and say, I want to be the next Oprah.
Yeah.
Well, there's only one O. With that being said, I also thank Oprah very much for her very, very powerful speech at the Golden Globes award ceremony back in January. And this quote comes to mind, and that is that we know the press is under siege these days. We also know it's the insatiable dedication to uncovering the absolute truth that keeps us from turning a blind eye to corruption and to injustice. She also added that the press, more than ever before, is important as we try to navigate these very, very complicated times. I think that we're seeing a bump in some J schools with regards to the Trump factor. And she closed by saying, what we know for sure is that speaking your truth is the most powerful tool we all have. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. I want to talk a little bit about some of the trends that we're seeing in terms of the communications industry, and I want to make it clear that I think journalism is a subset of the communications industry. If you look at the U.S. Department of Labor stats, the forecast calls for about a 6% growth rate between 2016 and 2026, and that's about as fast as the average for all occupations. But keep in mind that that's about 43,000 jobs, so that's pretty significant right there. Yeah. So there will be jobs, and there will be different kinds of jobs, however. Two areas that I think that it's important that we talk about, in addition to news jobs, there is a projected decline in what I call newsroom jobs, but there are different kinds of jobs that are emerging. And we're going to talk a little bit about what's happening in advertising and public relations, because in some programs, that's half of the J schools today, and that's an example from the University of North Texas. I think advertising and public relations are also growth areas, and people of color are generally underrepresented in these areas as well. And these are just two interesting stats from the U.S. Labor Department forecast between 2016 and 2026. The forecast growth rate for advertising, promotion, and marketing managers is a 10% growth rate. And I think that's significant because that's faster than the average for overall occupations. I also have an MBA from George Washington, just as an FYI. Okay. Likewise, the labor forecast for that same decade is about a 9% growth rate for PR specialists. Keep in mind, though, I think that those are obviously good indicators. So there are lots of jobs out there. The challenge is, and I also want to make it a point to say that you're looking at opportunities in the private sector, but also you need to look at opportunities in the nonprofit sector, NGOs, yes. And there are entrepreneurial opportunities that come to mind. I'm sure you're familiar with Blavity. Yes. That's just one example. They secured more than $6.5 million in startup money. And this is a media company that's targeting millennials. So I'm very encouraged by that.
And you mentioned earlier, Ms. Bland, about you need to be a multimedia journalist. What does that term mean?
That means that you can't be a one-trick pony. There are people who say, I want to be a reporter, or I just want to take pictures. No. You need to make sure that you have multiple skill sets. And we often talk about MOJOs, mobile journalists. So that means that you need to use a variety of platforms to tell stories. That's what I mean when I say you need to be a mobile journalist.
So with that said, what advice would you give to current HBC students that are majoring in any area or field of communications, including advertising and public relations, in terms of finding a job after graduation?
That's a great question. I'm going to give you, 5, 10 tips. The first thing that I'm going to say is that I would encourage students to embrace every opportunity to learn. And I think that part of your job as a student, and I think it was Oprah who said college is preparation for life. Mm-hmm. And that's true. You need to ask yourself, what is your unique value proposition? And be true to it. Can you code? Are you a great designer or what? Before you graduate, I would encourage every student to take a media entrepreneurship and a marketing class, because you're going to be managing your brand for the rest of your life. The second thing I would suggest is that you start networking today. If you have 5-10 minutes on your phone, I'm going to ask you, what are you doing with that 5 or 10 minutes on your phone while you're waiting for a class to start? Mm-hmm. Make sure that you're building your network constantly. You need to join a professional organization while you are a freshman so that you start building those connections, whether it's NABJ, SPJ, the RSSA, the Online News Association, or whatever. Invest in yourself. That's the other thing I'm going to say. I also am a big believer in hands-on and experiential learning, and I would encourage students to apply for programs like the NABJ Multimedia Short Course, the CBS News Fellowship Program, and the Scripps Howard Internship Program. Those are just three that come to mind. So those are ways for you to get experience while you're in college. The fifth thing that I'm going to suggest is that you need to write, report, and produce as much as you possibly can. This is a business where employers still believe in, I think it's Missouri, the state that has the Show Me as their slogan.
Show me state.
They want to know they want to know what you can do. I think it's great to have good grades, and you're going to need those good grades to get into grad school. At the same time, employers are going to say, well, what can you do and what can you show me that you've done, evidence of your work. The next thing I'm going to suggest is that you learn a second language. Whether that's Spanish, Mandarin, Japanese, or whatever you choose. And I say that because I know how important it is. And you need to get a passport, because if something happens, whether it's Syria, Japan, wherever, if you're ready to go, you're more likely to be called to do that assignment. Calvin Hayes is one of my former students, and he and his wife Sunshine, they met at FAM, and they are now doing wonderful things all over the world. So that's why it's so important to learn a second language. It gives you more options and opportunities. The next thing I want to suggest is that you need to get some internships before you graduate. Please do not show up the last semester and say, I need an internship. I've been out of school for a while, but I will also say that I had 3 internships before I graduated. And I think it's critical that you get at least 2 internships before you graduate. And here's how I look at internships. I will ask students sometimes, would you marry someone that you hadn't gone on a date with? And they look at me like, Professor Bland, you're getting in my business. No, I'm not getting in your business. But think about it. You are investing in a college degree, and you want to make sure that the field that you choose is a good fit. So that's why you do an internship. It gives you some experience, and it's a very, very competitive business, and you're going to need that as a leg up. I talked earlier about managing your brand. I can't say enough about how important that is. And with regards to managing your brand, I'm encouraging students to scan your social media. Look at Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, WhatsApp, whatever. And you're 3 clicks away from if you are 3 clicks away from someone finding something that you would not be proud of, find a way to scrub and clean up your social media profile. Your employers are checking it out. You need to know that. And the final thing or tip that I would give would be find a mentor. But I will also say that it's important that you know that mentor relationships work both ways. Don't just ask what you can get, but what can you give to help someone else. So those are the tips that I would give students.
Very interesting. I really appreciate that. That's very helpful, Ms. Bland. And so you mentioned in one of your tips about, actually a couple of your tips reference internships, employment, as well as grad school. So I'm assuming that, and I know this would depend on what field of communications or journalism that you are, concentrating in. But for students that are majoring in journalism or communications in general, what would you recommend after graduation, finding a job or considering grad school?
I would say, why not do both? And let me explain why I say why not do both. It's a very competitive business, as I said earlier. If you can land a full-time job in the business that you love, get it. Take it. Okay. Also, I'm going to suggest that you consider grad school while you're still single and unattached. And the reason I say that is that it gets a lot more complicated after you're married and have kids and a mortgage, etc. If you are considering grad school, I'd like to put in just a quick plug for the UNT Frank W. and Sue Mayborn School of Journalism, where you can get a master's degree in journalism. And we also have what I call a traditional track, but we also have 100% online master's degree in digital communication analytics in 2 years or less. And thanks to the generosity of Sue Mayborn, we also offer $10,000 a year to full-time Mayborn scholars. So, with that being said, if you think you want to teach someday, I would strongly encourage you to get that master's degree early, because as most colleges nowadays, they do require having a master's degree to teach at the collegiate level. And also consider getting your PhD if you know you want to be a professor someday, because there's a critical need for more professors of color.
Yeah.
Less than 3% of the folks in the country have PhDs, and then when you look at people of color, cut that in half. So that's why there's such a critical need. And there are a number of programs. I know Texas State has a PhD digital boot camp, and I have several friends who've gone through that. Ingrid Surges at Howard comes to mind, who's participated, and Joanne Livingston, who's a UNT alum, has also participated. There's also a PhD project that has been around for at least 2 decades, and that's for folks who are interested. They've been very deliberate and intentional about helping people of color get PhDs, particularly in the area of business. So those are programs that I think that students need to know about.
Ms. Bland, I want to go back to, I want to recap a couple of things that have come up in this conversation that I find just really interesting. You mentioned earlier that you mentioned at the beginning of this that you feel that the job market for journalism is strong right now. You also mentioned that you have an MBA, and you mentioned that it is helpful for communication students in general to be, I believe the term you used was multimedia journalists.
Yes.
And you've also talked about, you mentioned in your tips, you talked about making sure that a student, or ensuring for a student to ensure that they are doing either a marketing course and you said entrepreneurship course. So is it safe to say that journalism and, by and large communications is different, but is still a very viable way of making a living after college?
Everyone needs communication skills, absolutely. I think that the difference is that if you were thinking that you're going to have one job for life, that's no longer the case. You're going to when I think about my career path, I've had at least 8 to 10 different jobs. I expect students will have many more. And what's important is that you have the flexibility to turn on a dime, and you have skill sets that you can take to a variety of opportunities. And obviously, you have to be ready for those opportunities. So that's why I think that communication will. Everyone tells stories, whether it's Nike, whether it's Target. There are corporate communication jobs all over this country. But also, and I'm going to give you an example. I have one of our former students, Blessing, in Dallas. She literally helped develop the social media campaigns for the police department in Dallas, just as an FYI. So, there are jobs that didn't exist 20 years ago, whether it's SEO specialists, multimedia producers. Those are the kinds of opportunities that we need to have our students ready to take advantage of. There's been a sea of change, yes. There have been layoffs in the industry, no doubt about that. But what's different is that when I talk about having those multiple skill sets, you cannot be a one-trick pony and expect to be competitive.
And it sounds like for journalism students or journalism students, communication students, especially those at HBCUs, SEO, which is for those that do not know listening to this, search engine optimization, as well as coding, are skills that need to be added to your current repertoire, so to speak.
Yes, I would encourage those to your toolkit. The other thing, the area that's really, really hot, and that's why we have launched the 100% online master's degree in digital communication analytics, is understanding the metrics and translating them. I've had students say, well, I'm not real good at numbers. Guess what? We need to get over the numbers phobia. I'm a journalist who has an MBA. We should be able to do numbers.
Analytics is becoming more and more important as a measuring tool, as hard data to assess the success and reach of what you're putting out there these days. So I wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah, and one of the things that's interesting is that, how can I say this? There was a time when we didn't really focus on audience. When I got into the business, my editor says, news is the story that I assigned to you today, and that's what you're going to cover. It's a very, very different world. Yeah. We need to be focused on audiences and how we drive those audiences. We still need to tell those tough stories. At the same time, it's now advertisers. I think it was Ken Doctor who said, back in the day, newspapers sold space and broadcasters sold time. Well, now advertisers want audience, and there's clearly a greater emphasis on metrics, and that's another piece that I would add to the toolkit.
But if I hear you correctly, there's a fine line between clickbait and integrity.
Oh, yes. And let me say this. I think that integrity always matters, and I think speaking truth to power matters as well. You have to be digitally savvy, but I'm not suggesting that people go and do what I call just join aggregation farms and be there are jobs there, but that's not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I'm saying literally we just need to have a better appreciation of audience, and I'm like most folks, I'm concerned about the increasing political polarization that's taken place in this country, the amplification of fake news and misinformation and data manipulation. Those are all concerns that I have. But I do think that how you win is that you need to make sure that we're speaking truth and making sure that we're telling those stories, because there are eons of stories that are not being told, particularly with people of color. There are opportunities.
Yep. And are there untapped resources or best practices that you can advise potential journalists at HBCUs to utilize when searching for a job after graduation?
That's a great question. I'm going to, some of the things that I've said earlier, I'm just going to repeat because I think that they need to be amplified. Yeah. And that is, the first thing is you need to be intentional and embrace every opportunity to learn. And I mean that, every opportunity to learn. Start networking today. Don't put it off and say, "Oh, I'll do this when I graduated." Blah blah blah. No. Start today. What can you do? What can you do today? Let me give you an example. Freshen up your LinkedIn and go in and check it on a regular basis, and freshen up your web and social media presence. If you're, and let me say this: I like music, I like theater, I like drama. At the same time, I can't spend all my Facebook time wondering what's happening with Beyonce. We need to be intentional. I'm serious. And so I just want to make sure that we are looking at what's going on in our social media diet and also what's in our news diet.
Hold up, Ms. Bland. We do want to watch her and Jay-Z right now because they're shining a spotlight on HBCUs. So we appreciate that. Pay attention to that by all means. Keep going.
Okay. And I like Queen Bee. I'm going to be honest, but at the same time, I think that we need to be intentional about what we do. Now, the other thing that I'm going to say is that students need to have a digital portfolio, and they need to freshen it up. That includes your resume, samples of your work, testimonials, how to contact you. Those are all things that literally. That's one of the things that LinkedIn has brought. People will look at your LinkedIn profile and make assumptions, and if there's nothing there, then that also tells me something. So freshen up that digital portfolio. The other thing that I'm in terms of what students can do when they're searching for a job, I talked about the importance of networking. And if I were a student who were graduating in May, I would make sure I would be at the NABJ convention and work it like a job, because that's a tremendous job and career fair opportunity. Where else will you meet thousands, and I want to say this again, thousands of journalists and recruiters. Right. If this is what you want to do for a living, then you need to invest in yourself. I would also say that there are tremendous opportunities for, websites like journalismjobs.com, fellowships, and the various organizations that I talked about earlier, whether it's NABJ, SPJ, PRSSA, ONA, et cetera. I would also encourage students to keep in touch with your professors and the career centers and alumni networks. Those are things that, if you're part of the FAM network, that's a global network. You also need to make sure that you're mindful of the contacts that you make at professional conferences. Don't just collect business cards. Follow up with nice notes. Write thank you notes. That's the other thing that I would say. That those are personal touches, and you need to have something that's going to set you aside from the others. And the final thing that I would say, keep learning. And I always ask, what are you reading or doing to improve yourself? And let me give you, in addition to what I call diversifying your daily news media diet, And I ask students, okay, so tell me about the apps that you have on your phone, and do you have, you pick what's on your phone, but you need to make sure that you have something that keeps you up to date with regard to what's going on in the world in your media diet. I also encourage students to read, and I'm going to give a plug for Richard Prince and his journalism column that's available online. He has a great handle on the pulse of what's going on in this nation and the world with regards to diversity issues. So I read his column regularly. I'm a big reader, and I also want to share several books that I recommend that students read. Okay. And let's see. First off, if you want to be a broadcaster, I would suggest that you read Byron Pitt's autobiography, and it's titled Stepping Out on Nothing. He came to FAM when I was there, and give a shout out to Kim Godwin. She's a senior vice president now at CBS News, and she's a FAM alum. Just an amazing journey that she has, and that gives students hope. And if you want to be a White House correspondent, read April Lyon's book. It's titled Under Fire, Reporting from the Front Lines of the Trump White House.
Yeah.
Okay. If you want to be a PR professional, read Diverse Voices. This is a new book out that's called Diverse Voices, Profiles in Leadership, and it's edited by Shelley and Barry Spector. I also just want to give a shout out to Neil Foote. He's a friend and a colleague, and president of and CEO of Foote Communications, and president of the National Black PR Society. He's also done some work for Tom Joyner and the Joyner Foundation.
He's also our media consultant at Tom Joyner Foundation. That's right.
Yes. So there again, someone that you need to know and can be inspired by. The other two books that I'm going to suggest is Why Not Win by Larry Thornton. And I love music, as I said earlier, and I would recommend that you read Tom Joyner's book. I'm just a DJ, but it makes sense to me because he has an incredible story to tell, and he wrote that book with Mary Flowers Boyce. Yep. So those are books that I would suggest that folks read.
What's the biggest misconception amongst HBCU graduates, in your opinion, about the current job market today?
That's a great question. I think one of the myths is that all the hot jobs are as reporters. And I've been a reporter, editor, and a publisher, and done marketing consulting work as well, and been a professor. So you'll have multiple jobs. I think one of the misconceptions is that all the hot jobs are as reporters, or that I want to be on camera. That's a problem. There are a lot more jobs behind the camera as multimedia producers, search engine optimization specialists, social media producers, than in front of the camera. And everybody's not suited to do on-camera work. So I think that that's important for students to be mindful of. Another myth, I think, is that I'm from a big city. I need to be in a big city to make a difference.
Yeah.
No. Scratch that thought. Go to a smaller community market and work your way up. You will learn, you will grow, and when you can't, literally, I mean, you will grow in ways that you do not imagine when you go to a place that you've never been before. And start your career. Anyone, and I've counseled students, I say, I can live anywhere for a year to 2 years. And that first, whether you're in a market 125, if you're from Dallas or you're from Miami, don't assume that you're going to always be in that city. And I'm going to tell you a couple of stories of students that I'm very, very proud of. Kristen Holloway was one of our NABJ babies. And Kristen, please forgive me if I call you a baby because I know you're a full-grown woman. But she was part of the cohort that came through when I was at FAM, and she's had several moves, and she's now, one of her goals was to get back to Atlanta, and she's now a reporter in Atlanta. So that's a success story. Tasia Smith comes to mind also. She's in St. Louis. Those are students who had to go to different markets to get back to places where they, quote, the big city markets. So I think that that's important for students to know. Your first job won't be your last job. You will have multiple jobs.
Well, Ms. Bland, thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about the opportunities and the possibilities for, communications graduates at HBCUs as they approach graduation. This has been very helpful and very constructive. So with that said, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more HBCUbiquity.
HBCU.
we get back to the HBCUbiquity podcast, let's take a look at some Tom Joyner Foundation fundraising highlights. Here's an example of TJF's success.
Hi, my name is Dante Webb, a junior majoring in physics at Dillard University. I'm from Dallas, Texas. I want to take this opportunity to say thank you to the Dillard University Dallas Alumni Chapter and Tom Joyner Foundation for providing me with this scholarship. After graduation, I will attend Georgia Tech to obtain my master's in mechanical engineering.
To donate to the Tom Joyner Foundation, just log on to www.tomjoynerfoundation.org and you can help a student continue their education at a HBCU.
You know, college is a place where students go to learn and acquire skills needed to support themselves and or their families throughout the duration of their lives. HBCUs have been doing this for over 150 years, and until the last 50 years or so, we're the only academic and vocational training ground available to Black America. During these last 50 years, we've seen the workplace in general diversify. Black men and women have ascended to executive levels, the boardroom, even the presidency of the United States. But as you've heard in these conversations on today, there are still several more steps that HBCU graduates need to take to increase the chances of landing in the right career path after graduation. If you have a child, grandchild, as my mother would say, if you have grands, nieces, nephews, friends, or if you know someone at an HBCU that's close to graduation, this is a good episode to share with them. Life after college is closer than they may expect, and this was a conversation that was packed with more food for thought than can be digested in just one take. As a race, we've come a long way, but we're still far from where we want to be or where we need to be. Our students, especially those that are currently enrolled at HBCUs, are, to quote George Benson, and or Whitney Houston too, depending on how old school you claim to be, but they're our future. We owe it to them and to ourselves to prepare them as much as we can to carry the torch. That's what HBCUs do. That warm and deep embrace that HBCUs provide to their students. But the rest of us can't and we shouldn't count on our schools to do the job by themselves. That's where all of us come in, to supplement that HBCU nurturing preparation that's delivered through conversations like these. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. To learn more about the Tom Joyner Foundation and the historically Black colleges and universities that we support, please visit us at www.tomjoynerfoundation.org. Do you have a comment or a question about this week's episode? Let us know on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at HBCUbiquity. That's HBCUbiquity. I'm Thomas Joyner Jr. Thank you for listening to this week's episode, and please subscribe and come back next week for another episode of HBCUbiquity.